Today we're going to talk about overcoming resentment. Resentment. The dictionary defines resentment as bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly. Have you ever felt resentful about something that happened to you? About something that someone did to you? Today I want to share with you this big idea through the story of the life of Joseph, that resentment can weigh us down until we are willing to shed it. And as you think about resentment and how it can weigh you down, you think about the different events that happen in your life, and you can picture them somewhat as a bag. Each time we have a resentment, a situation in our lives, and we start to feel a little resentment, we start to put these various bags onto our lives, and they start to weigh us down, they start to carry us down, and we start to go through life. But you know what? We keep putting these bags on, don't we? Because more and more people start giving us reasons to be resentful, and before long, we're carrying them around, and we literally are weighed down completely by bags of resentment. What is this called? It's called bearing grudges, right? We bear many, many grudges in our lives. The dictionary defines grudge as a persistent feeling of ill will or resentment resulting from a past injury. And so resentment can lead to wearing bags of grudges that we're carrying around with us for a long, long time. Today I want to ask you, how do we overcome resentment? How do we allow ourselves to not be weighed down by resentment? And you know, the perfect person to help us think through that is the Old Testament character that we've been exploring by the name of Joseph. Turn, if you would, to Genesis 37, and we're going to take another look at the life of Joseph as we think about Joseph the overcomer. We have seen that he has overcome many things throughout his life. He overcame hardships, being sold into slavery, being thrown in prison. We saw how he overcame disappointments as he was languishing in prison, waiting for God to finally come through and give him his release. We saw many ways in which he has struggled and yet overcome. The last time that we gathered together to talk about the life of Joseph, we looked at this great reunion of Joseph with his brothers, the ones who had betrayed him. And we looked at the story from their perspective. And we asked the question, how did Joseph lead his brothers through the process of overcoming their guilt for what they had done to him? And we saw how Joseph help them trigger guilt so that it could be transformed by God's grace. But today we're going to look at this encounter from the perspective of Joseph, because I believe that Joseph was a man, although he was a wonderful, holy man who did many wonderful things, I think he still had to struggle with whether or not he would wear those bags of resentment as he went through his journey in life. How did he shed those bags and experience forgiveness? That's what I want to talk with you about today. And the way that I want to organize this journey through the life of Joseph is by tracing the teardrops of Joseph. Gene Getz, in his great book on Joseph, says, we know more about Joseph's tears and why he wept than any other Old Testament character. Now, before you worry, men, he was a man's man. In fact, the Bible describes him as well-built and handsome. Remember Potiphar's wife? He was a man's man, and yet he was a man who cried, who wept more than any other Old Testament character that we have in the Bible. And as we trace the teardrops of Joseph, we will discover how we can shed the resentment that we would experience in life and move forward to forgiveness. Let's follow those teardrops as we think about the first one today. The first teardrops are teardrops of pain, and they're found in Genesis 37, verses 34 through 35. This is after he has been thrown in a pit and been sold as a slave to the Midianites and carted off to Egypt. And after his brothers have a conspiracy and they bring back his coat of many colors dipped in blood, and they tell his father under conspiracy, we don't know what happened to him. He must have been eaten by a lion. And what do we see? We see the first set of tears that are shed in this story. But actually, these tears are not the tears of Joseph. They are the tears of his father. Notice what it says in verse 35. All his sons and daughters came home to him to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. They were tears that were shed for, I believe, many, many years. His father would not see his son until almost 22 years later. How many tears did he shed during that time, those 2 decades of separation from his son? But how many tears did Joseph shed during that time? The reality is we do not have a record of Joseph shedding a tear during those 17 years from when he arrived in Egypt until he ascended to the second in command under Pharaoh. But what we do know is that as a human being, he no doubt experienced many tears. And in fact, we find that as he rises up to power, we see in the next set of verses that he experiences this pain and this loss. And if you can just forward that slide, I don't know why we're having trouble, Brent, but if you can forward that, that would be great. If not, if you could exit out of that and reboot it, and reboot the slide, that'd be great. But we know that Joseph experienced much pain and sorrow because when he actually rose to power in Egypt and became the second in command, and he had a son, 2 sons, it named them in a way that described how he handled the pain through all of that time. I want you to see in Genesis chapter 41, verses 50 to 52, how Joseph expresses the pain that he experienced, even in naming his sons. Notice what it says in Genesis chapter 41, verse 50. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn son Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. All my trouble. Throughout this whole time, Joseph is experiencing many troubles. Now let me ask you, do you think he experienced these troubles without any sense of sadness or pain or tears? He named his second son Ephraim, and he said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Even in his suffering, he experienced God's hand of blessing. But yet, in his suffering, no doubt, he experienced some tears. How many tears did he shed during those 17 years? We'll never know for sure, but we do know that he experienced much pain and suffering. What we know next is that as the reunion of Joseph and his brothers commences, we start to see teardrops begin to fall as Joseph, one by one, begins to walk through this process of overcoming resentment. And I want you to notice that this next teardrop, and I'll call it the tears of empathy, develop. Notice in chapter 42 and verse 24 that Joseph encounters his brothers. And he begins to try and understand where their hearts are. What he knows and they know are 2 different things. They do not know that he is their long-lost brother. And they are talking to him through an interpreter. Do you remember that part of the story? And as they're talking to him through an interpreter, he understands their native language. They don't know it. And they begin to talk amongst themselves. And Reuben says, how could we have done this to our brother? How could we have done this evil thing to him? Do you remember that part of the story? And Joseph is listening to that. And I want you to notice in Genesis 42, verse 24, it says he turned away from them and began to what? To weep. But then came back and spoke to them. And then he had Simeon taken from him and bound before their eyes as part of the test that he was going to help them undergo to expose their guilt. This is the first teardrop recorded of Joseph in this journey over resentment. And what does this teardrop represent? I think for the first time in Joseph's 22 years since he's been separated from his brothers, he's beginning to see this from their perspective. He's beginning to have compassion on his brothers. That's why I call it tears of empathy and compassion. He shed his tears because he understood that his brothers were beginning to experience the guilt that they felt and experiencing the pain, and they were expressing that. And I want to suggest to you that if you're trying to overcome resentment, that when God shows you the pain of the other, not just your pain, and you can shed a tear of empathy and compassion, it's the beginning of healing of that resentment, because now you're beginning to see that I'm not the only one who's in pain. There are others who are in pain over this situation. It's important to shed those tears of empathy and compassion. As the story continues, he gives them a test. He puts Simeon in prison, and he says, if you want Simeon to be released, you come back with your youngest brother Benjamin. Do you remember that? And so they go back to Canaan, and they're waiting and waiting and waiting because they don't want to go back and face this governor of Egypt. But finally his father says, go ahead and go and bring my son Benjamin. And they arrive back in Egypt. And they arrive back in Egypt with Joseph's little brother Benjamin. And it is there that I believe that Joseph sheds another tear. It's a tears of grace, if you would forward that. Notice what it says in verse 30 of chapter 43. It says that Joseph was deeply moved at the sight of his brother. He saw his brother Benjamin. He hadn't seen him in 22 years. Benjamin was now a young man in his late 20s. He was seeing him for the first time as a young man. And I want you to notice what the text says. He was deeply moved at the sight of his brother. Deeply moved. And he hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and he wept there. What were these tears? What did they represent? I believe at this moment, Joseph is experiencing the tears of grace and hope. Why? I believe he's believing now for the first time that there's a possibility of reconciliation. There's a possibility of hope. He is seeing hope in person, in the person of Benjamin. For all these years, he has wondered and worried whether or not his mean brothers have done the same thing to Benjamin that they did to him. And for the first time now, he's seeing there is hope. God's grace can enter into this situation. God can transform this situation. God can bring reconciliation, for these brothers have kept his youngest brother safe. These tears of grace and hope shed are an important part of overcoming resentment. I believe that when we experience God's grace and forgiveness in our lives, when God gives us moments, when we understand that God could make good out of a bad situation, we begin to experience these tears of grace and hope. And it's an important step in overcoming resentment, because for the first time, Joseph probably feels he does not have to be a victim of these circumstances any longer. These circumstances no longer have to define his family. There is hope beyond this. And you know what he does right after this? He throws a party for his whole family. He gets all his brothers together and he numbers them from the youngest to the oldest. And they're looking at each other and they're saying, how did he know our ages? How did he know our birth order? And he gives them a wonderful meal, and he gives fivefold portion to his brother Benjamin, but he gives everyone enough to eat, more than they can ever. He displays for them the grace of forgiveness before he actually forgives them. He shows them grace, and he says, I'm going to overcome this resentment by showing you goodwill even though you do not deserve it. One of the keys to overcoming resentment in our lives is being willing to show grace to someone who doesn't deserve it. Overcoming resentment through tears of grace and hope. Well, that moves Joseph and the story forward even more to the next set of tears. And I describe these tears as the tears of forgiveness. It reaches a point where he hears a confession that shows him definitively that his brothers have finally understood what they have done to him. Their intention to murder him, their intention to remove his name from this earth. They understood it. They understood their guilt. And Joseph comes face to face with that, and he understands they are repentant and remorseful for what they have done. And I want you to notice in Genesis 45, verse 2, what happens after Joseph encounters that. It says, and he wept so loudly that all the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Imagine that scene. This well-built, burly of a man weeping uncontrollably. So much so that everyone around him understood that something had happened, something had snapped in his life. What had happened? I believe at this moment he is shedding tears of forgiveness. He is releasing his right to hold anything else further against his brothers. He's letting it all go. Have you ever had that experience in your life where you've had to let go of your right to resent or to even think of harming someone for what they've done to you? Have you ever had that emotional release? This is the kind of emotional release that Joseph is experiencing. And I believe he's weeping and wailing uncontrollably. The text tells us that everyone knew it. He was experiencing this release. He could no longer hold anything against his brothers. He had to freely forgive them. And he was shedding those tears of forgiveness. Well, that leads us for another tear that is shed, and it is the tears of reconciliation. For now, his father comes back to Egypt, and when he sees his father for the first time, as it's recorded in Genesis 45, verses 14 and 15, he now sheds tears of reconciliation. I want you to notice how it's described. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin, and he wept. And Benjamin embraced him, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. He has this reconciliation with his brothers, and that leads to another set of tears of reconciliation. And that is the tears of reconciliation when he encounters his father. And that's described in Genesis 46, verse 29. When he sees his father for the first time in 22 years. Picture this. It says Joseph had his chariot made ready, and he went to Goshen to meet his father Israel, or Jacob. And as soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father. And notice what it says. He wept for a long time. How long did he wait? How long did he weep? A long time. Now, a lot of us have a hard time weeping at all, let alone a long time. Letting our emotions express themselves is hard for us to do. It's hard for me to do. But here's the reality. These were tears of joy. These were tears of reconciliation. These were tears of saying, Lord, you finally did it. I had been praying for this for 22 years. And you finally answered my prayer. This is a tear where when you shed these tears, it's a tear of rejoicing that God has taken those bags off. Not only has He taken those bags off, but He's given you the relationship back. When God does something like that in your life, that's worth weeping for a long time. Have you ever had that experience where God has restored a relationship that you thought would never, ever be restored? That's worth crying tears of joy over. The reality is, though, not everyone can experience that. Sometimes the best that can happen is we can release our resentment toward another, but it's not always possible that that reconciliation can happen. But when it does, if it does, oh wow, what a time of rejoicing that is. And he wept long time, tears of reconciliation and rejoicing over what God had done. Joseph is now reunited with his father Jacob in the land. And for the next 17 years, Jacob lives in the land with all of his sons together. And they experience the goodness of Pharaoh as Pharaoh gives them some of the best land in Egypt. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next week as we talk about how the process of reconciliation actually happens. Because it's important to understand that there is a process for restoring broken relationships, and we'll talk about that next week. But as we fast forward through all of that very quickly, we reach a point of another set of tears that Joseph now is shedding. And it's the tears of loss. For 17 years have passed, and now Joseph is shedding the tears as he has lost his father. Look what it says in Genesis chapter 50, verse 1. Genesis chapter 50, verse 1 describes this teardrops that Joseph sheds this way. As he learns of his father's death, it says in Genesis 50, verse 1, Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. Now, you say, how is that a tear shed in overcoming resentment? It's a tear of loss. He's lost his father. But I want to suggest to you that these are good tears. These are tears, yes, you experience loss, but there's a lot of tears of thankfulness in this as well, because he's thankful that he was able to have the reunion. He was able to experience that reunion with his father, and he's letting go his father. He's saying, I had him for 17 years. But you know, there were probably some temptations along the way for him. As he's experiencing the loss of his father, perhaps in his mind he's thinking, but I could have had more time with him. If my brothers weren't so mean, if my brothers didn't treat me so unfairly, I could have had more time with him. You see, there was the possibility of resentment re-entering back into his heart now that he had lost his father. And this is the final test that Joseph and his brothers will experience as his father departs. Now the question is, what will the relationship with his brothers be now that his father has departed? And that brings us to our last set of tears that Joseph shed. And they're described for us in chapter 50, verse 17. And I want you to notice how they're described in Genesis chapter 50, verse 17. His brothers are fearful that now that their father has died, that Joseph will turn the corner and begin to treat them poorly, begin to treat them and express the resentment that maybe he still held in his heart toward his brothers. And I want you to notice in Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 15, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers and the sins of the wrong they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God of your father. When this message came to Joseph, it says, he reacted angrily and said, sorry, Dad is dead. Now you're getting... Oh, I'm sorry, that's not what it says. It says he wept. He wept. He shed tears of forgiveness again. He had already forgiven them. You know, forgiveness is a process that we have to extend on and on. Now he has to forgive them one more time. Why? Because they are afraid that now that the daddy is dead, that he's going to revert to an old self. He's going to revert and he's going to practice retribution at this point. Vengeance. But he shed tears. Shed tears of releasing himself from being able to experience any more resentment. He expresses forgiveness in those tears. I want you to notice what he says next to them as it continues in verse 18. His brothers came and threw themselves before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But notice what it says in verse 19. "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.' And so he said to them, 'Don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your family.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." What was Joseph doing? He was forgiving them again. Forgiveness is often a process, not a one-time thing. It's a process of releasing our resentment again and again. When resentment rears its ugly head, and it could have in Joseph's life, because he could have said, "You know what? Dad is dead, and I only got to experience 17 years with him in Egypt. That's not fair. I should have had more time with Dad." That resentment could have creeped in. He could have started putting more bags on. But instead, he shed that resentment through tears of forgiveness. And he expressed to them a model for what forgiveness is. What does forgiveness look like? In your sermon outline, you'll see that there's a little chart there that expresses forgiveness. And in the story of Jesus, in the story of Joseph and Jesus, we see this illustrated wonderfully. Forgiveness isn't something you do when you're no longer hurting. Joseph was hurting all along this process, as evidenced by his tears. Forgiveness isn't something you can do only when you're not hurting. Forgiveness is something that you do in the middle of your hurt. Forgiveness is also not forgetting what has happened. Notice what Joseph says to the brothers. "You intended it for evil." He understands what they did. He hasn't forgotten that act of evil that they perpetrated against him. It's not forgetting what has happened to you, but it's something that you're able to do despite it. You're never able, perhaps, to erase the memory of what has happened. But the emotional impact and the claim that it holds on your heart and the resentment that it builds up within you is something that you begin to release, even though you remember the events as if they were yesterday. The final thing to understand in the story of Joseph, as it illustrates for us, is that forgiveness is not ignoring or excusing an offense. Forgiveness is not saying, "Oh, no, it doesn't matter." The reality is it matters. That's why we experience and feel resentment. It matters. But what do? We're addressing a sin, but we're refusing to retaliate for it. Joseph, at this point in his life, had the power to retaliate against his brothers, but he refused to do that. That's what forgiveness looks like. Joseph was releasing his resentment by showing acts of kindness. Now, as we close, I want you to think about how Joseph allows us to see the picture of Jesus even more clearly. The Bible describes Jesus as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. That's a description of Jesus 600 years before in the prophet Isaiah. It describes Jesus as a man who would experience sorrow. Just like Joseph, we know a lot about the tears of Jesus. And there are 3 instances in which we see Jesus very definitively shed tears. One of them is pictured, if you would, in John 11:35. And it is the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Go home and memorize it today. It's a challenge you. John 11:35. You ready? Let's say it. Jesus wept. He wept at the death of his dear friend Lazarus. Jesus is a man who was willing to experience grief and to show it. It also says that as Jesus was headed to the city of Jerusalem, as he stood by the city of Jerusalem, knowing that he would go to Jerusalem and he would be crucified on a cross there, it says that as he drew near to the city, he wept over it. Jesus not only wept for his friends, he wept for his enemies. He wept over the city of Jerusalem. He was able to experience that grief. And the Bible describes his life this way in Hebrews 5:7. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Jesus was a man's man. He was a carpenter. He worked with stone and wood. I'm sure he had some pretty strong arms. I don't think he was a wimp, but he was a man who was willing to embrace grief, to be able to express it constructively. And for many of us, the problem with overcoming resentment is we don't ever want to acknowledge that we're in pain. And so we now can go to Jesus as our high priest because we have a high priest who is able to sympathize with us in our weakness. The Bible describes that in Hebrews chapter 4, that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness. So I interpret that this way. He is able to sympathize with you in your pain because he's experienced the pain. He had never sinned, but he experienced all the hardships that you and I experienced. The hardships that we hold in our hearts, that we put in bags and we throw on around ourselves, weigh us down. Jesus is able to sympathize. And one of the greatest acts that Jesus did on the cross was one greater than Joseph. Joseph forgave his brothers for betraying him. Jesus forgave his brothers for crucifying him. For on the cross, as he's hanging on the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus was willing to extend forgiveness to those who had treated him so poorly. He shows us the model of releasing our resentment and being willing to give goodness to those who treat us poorly. So if you're here today and you're saying, I'm carrying these bags of resentment, I want to encourage you today through the work of grace to shed those bags and come to Jesus, who is able to sympathize with you in your weakness. He is one who has not sinned, so when you go to him, he understands you and he will forgive you. He will cleanse you. He will wash you. He will take off one bag at a time, if only you'll let him grab them from you. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this vivid story of a man who showed grace to those who harmed him, who showed forgiveness, a man's man who shed tears to remind us of the one greater than Joseph, who shed tears all the way to the cross. And on the cross, he bore the burden of all of our sins. He took the guilt, not only of our guilt, but the guilt of those who harmed us. And in forgiving us, he gives us grace so that we can forgive others. Lord, I pray that you would speak to our hearts and allow us to release that resentment and to experience the release of forgiveness this day. Lord, if there be anyone who sinned against us, I pray by your Spirit that you would give us the grace, and even give us the grace to shed the tears of grace, forgiveness. Lord, I pray healing on your people in Jesus' name, and all of God's people said, amen.